Hello, and this is the first video lesson for you in Journalism and Media Arts 370, Typography, with Brett Erickson. Today is a lesson in basically the three main types of serif fonts and how they developed over the course of, really about 300 years or so, 350 years. And after that point, of course, we have more of the development in what typographically is called the modern era. We then have the development of advertising faces that are sans serif and beyond. That era is detailed nicely in your book by Gavin Ambrose. We won't look at that completely today. We will talk about that later on in some of these video elements, possibly. But today we're more worried about simply understanding why and what differentiated the main eras of typeface development. So this is typography, a historical view. And we begin with Gutenberg's Bible in 1455. Now it's understood that there were some that movable type had been used by the Chinese much earlier than Gutenberg. We also know that the Dutch were using a very crude type of movable type system as well. Gutenberg really is, it's misunderstood that Gutenberg invented it. Gutenberg really didn't invent it. He simplified it and made it much more elegant. The irony of this, of course, is after Gutenberg printed his Bible, he'd taken out some loans to finance this production, and he didn't make good on it. It took too long to produce the Bible, and as a result, he went to court over it, and he lost the court case. And the man who'd lent him the money to print the Bible took over. So Gutenberg himself was a colossal failure in this endeavor. But we remember Gutenberg, and we don't remember the guy who won the law case. In any case, before Gutenberg, when you wanted to produce a book, what happened was you had monks sitting in monasteries copying page by page. So it could take a decade to produce 20 books. That said, thus, literacy was something for the clerics of the clergy and for the nobility. The public was by and large utterly illiterate. It's one of the reasons that you see in many of the Gothic churches prior to the Renaissance and after the printing press came about. Stained glass windows were very important, not just because they were pretty, but because this is the only way you could actually tell stories to the public, because they couldn't read. So Gutenberg's Bible was very, very important in not only establishing a literate public, but also establishing a public that was aware of the role of typefaces. Readability began to matter. So what this meant was there was a new dissemination of knowledge within society. Aesthetics became more important. Early typefaces mirrored really the calligraphy that the monks would have used before the printing press was invented. But as literacy became more prevalent, more people became able to read, and thus eventually, over the centuries, advertising emerged as a very viable way of getting the public's attention. While advertising has been known far before what we would term the sans serif era, it really exploded with the Industrial Revolution around 1810 to 1830. So, early typefaces to late typefaces. We're going to move today from the Roman, it's also called Old Style. We're going to move from that period to the sans serif period. Okay? So let's move on really quickly. If we move down here first, I'm going to cut this off first. When we look at the notion of Old Style, we're really talking about typefaces that really emerged largely in France some in Germany. And this wasn't very long, maybe 100 years after Gutenberg's press came out. And in fact, in the case of Bembo, it was only 40 years afterward. Bembo is a very important face from the notion that it, in part, rejected the unseal form. Unseal is a type of calligraphy, but Bembo rejected in part that form. And as a result, it became the precursor, what we call the old style, to what we see today in terms of serif and sans serif typographic faces. Really, one of the most important other faces of this period is Garamond. This is done by Claude Garamond. It is a French face. The French were unique in this aspect from the fact that that art was part of the state. So there was significant financial support for this, and so Claude Garamond was able to essentially produce a font that was financially well supported enough that he could be very, very strong in its development. That said, those are all neat trivial pursuit questions. The reality is, though, is that Garamond typifies what we call the old style of serif typographic faces. How do you know these things? Well, ultimately, the way that this is found is by first, here, on the O, examining what we call the stress. And you can find what the stress is in an object, in an O or in a P or an R, simply by taking a line and drawing it from the thinnest spot on the top to the thinnest spot on the bottom. If the line is vertical, we say typically that that is a modern typeface. If it's only slightly canted, we would say that that's a transitional. And in the case where it has a significant oblique characteristic, like this O does in Garamond, we would say that this is an old style font. Now, it's not the only thing that qualifies it, but in this case, it's a good example of an old style or Roman typeface. You can see by the O with the magenta line that we have about a 10-degree angle. Okay, if this is 0, okay, or in the case of if you take this to be 360, it's at about a 350-degree angle. If you were to look at a modern, it would be exactly, or if this were 0, okay, you would say this is a -10 angle. Any of those measurements will work, but the reality is it's 10 degrees off of perpendicular to the baseline. One of the other elements that we can use to determine what kind of face it is the amount of contrast. Contrast can be very confusing for people, and the easiest way to really understand contrast is the difference in thickness between an arm or a crossbar, okay, and the stem, which is here. So the down element in the T is called the stem. This can be called the crossbar or the arm, okay. The arm is relatively thick yet, and the stem is still relatively thin. So there's not an exacerbated amount of difference between the thickness of the arm and the thickness of the stem. And we say that that's a low contrast, not a no contrast. We'll see one of those later. But it's a low contrast typeface. Last but not least, we pay attention to bracketing in the letters. And when we talk about the bracketing of letters, it means that there's a curved element both at the end of the serif and in the middle of the serif. And some of this had to do with the fact the amount of precision that was capable, as well as ink bleed. The papers were either vellum or very poor papers at this time, so there was a significant amount of bleeding. Thus, what happened was you had to have elements to essentially make the letters and the words more readable. This is one of the places that bracketing comes from. It also comes from the fact that pen marks looked somewhat like this as well. There is an aesthetic function to it. But brackets that tend to look very circular, and in fact when these were drawn, typeface designers would really draw circles there, so it does mirror the actual curve of a circle. So that is what characterizes an old face. And if you want to look at one that's key, you can look at Garamond by Adobe, and by and large that's a very accurate Garamond. ITC has one as well. You can also see some old examples of this. It does vary slightly from what Garamond's original typeface looked like. The second type we're going to deal with is transitional. Transitional really is a moment that is a few hundred years after Garamond and Bembo and some of the others had come out. Believe it or not, the 1700s were a very critical period in typeface development, not in France, but in England. William Caslon was a typesetter and developed a new typeface that was really the rage in England for a long time. He was at odds with Baskerville. If you can imagine a time period when people would debate the letters that were used to print their books. Today we're on information overload, and as a result we don't really pay attention to these things. We say that type disappears. The best type disappears. At that time, type was far more in the foreground of the readers. Caslon was released in 1725, and if you want the characteristics of it, since we've already talked about stress, Caslon is typified by using, and this is, by the way, is big Caslon. I do not have a copy of the original Caslon. I have hunted for it, and if I still can find it, I will. So I have mixed two Caslons here. The I on the right is Adobe Caslon Pro. The other two are big Caslon. So there are some inconsistencies here, but this is closer to the style that you would have seen from William Caslon in 1725. They're characterized by a much more vertical stress. So the stress in the O begins to come back. It might be 358 degrees or -2 degrees, -3 degrees. So we've effectively come close to vertical, but we're not quite there yet. If you look at the level of contrast, that is significant. And in fact, Baskerville, which we don't have here, Baskerville was demonized because he exaggerated the amount of contrast that existed in Caslon. So he even had to invent new inks to make that work so that it wouldn't bleed through the page. But ultimately, if you look at the arm of the T versus its stem, it is quite pronounced, the amount of contrast between those pieces. And then if you move on to the bracketing that's on the I, you'll notice that it is almost gone. Not quite. There's still a slight curve in there, but it's much less pronounced than it is if you were to go back and look at Garamond. Just a side note, I should have mentioned this earlier. It's very helpful if while we're doing this lesson you use the cheat sheet that I put up on Bronco board for you as well. That will be very helpful in you looking for yourself as we go through this to see exactly what these pieces look like as we go through. So I'm going to move down here. This is the third period, and really what's interesting is the modern period emerged in the same century as the transitional period. When we say modern, many people assume that it's the modernist phase of art, the modernist phase period of design, which was roughly 1920 to 1960. This happened much earlier. Typefaces were much more important to people at this time in terms of how they read books, how they looked at books, because remember, at best, woodblock printing was going to be out at this period. They didn't have photographs they could reprint for essentially nearly 100 years at this point. So type became much more critical at this point to actually creating a very readable and interesting book. I'll pause this for a minute. So in 1783, a Frenchman developed a new typeface. It was a very fashionable typeface, is a good way to characterize this. Bodoni was the same way. And this was essentially, again, a response to the aesthetic that was going to be present within typography at that time, and this represents the ascension of really what we would consider a modern typeface. In other words, it no longer approaches the aesthetic from the notion that it's trying to reproduce calligraphy or that it is in part calligraphic. So in this case, if we look at Dido, Dido can be characterized simply, number one, by vertical stress. And although it's not as good on the screen, there's a slight aliasing that's on these letters. That's an error in the PDF. You will notice that in the O, number one, the stress is perfectly vertical. And you could almost say that, that perhaps the stress is strongly vertical. It does now resemble the shape of an eye, and the shape of an eye then evokes a notion of humanism that's within this. And we'll talk somewhat about the humanist tendencies that were evident within typography. The humanist movement itself has had life in typography since the Renaissance. You can see some humanist tendencies emerge with Garamond. You can also see it strongly emerge over the course of the next few centuries. You will notice that now, as well, in the contrast, as well as the serifs are very squared off, and there's extreme contrast between the arm and the stem in Dido. And what this does is this makes for a typeface that is very, very good at display. It's not as good for reading. It tends to really blend together a little bit too much on the page. As a typographer, my preference is always for something like Caslon. Caslon is immensely readable. Garamond is an incredibly readable font. However, Dido tends to be very legible, so it's better at large sizes. It's not as good as a Sans Serif, but it is still very strong. Last but not least, then, you can notice the bracketing. There simply isn't any. There are some modern typefaces that do have minor bracketing, but it's almost indiscernible. So at this point, we're looking more at a serif that is just a flat line. And this was one of the innovations that was put forth in Dido, as well as Bodoni. And if you compare the two, Bodoni actually became an even more famous and more elegant typeface than Dido. It was a response by one typesetting house to the other. These houses were in extreme competition most of the time. But that is a modern typeface. So to review quickly, again, we'll start at the beginning. Old style tends to have stress that is clearly against the vertical, So it moves at least, and perhaps more, 10 degrees off of the vertical. The contrast is low, so the arm versus the stem doesn't have a lot of differentiation. The bracketing tends to be very symmetrical and very pronounced. In a transitional, you'll notice the stress is decreasing. It's moving toward the vertical. The contrast in the arm versus the stem is much stronger. And in the bracketing, the curves within the interior and the crotch of the bracketing are getting much smaller. Last but not least, then, in the modern typefaces, you'll notice a vertical stress. Lots of contrast, a pronounced set of contrast between the stem and the arm, and if even existent, almost non-existent brackets. Finally, the thing we move on to, at least about 100 years later, if not more, was the Sans Serif movement. And this was in response to a lot of the need for advertising and signage that it showed large. It was also a response to the industrialization. It was a scientific typeface. Okay? So when you look at many of the typefaces of this period, whether they be from Germany, whether they be from England, these are strong responses to the science of the time. Accidens Grotesque is from 1896. That is really considered the father face of this entire movement. News Gothic was one that was soon after that. And these are characterized, frankly, by no serifs, by low or no contrast. So if you look here, there's no contrast whatsoever between the arm and the stem, and there are no serifs. Some of the early typefaces had some modern Roman characteristics, so there was contrast in certain areas on, for instance, on the counters or on bowls. Ultimately, there's also been a humanist movement within sans serif, where there tends to be some use of a movement to look more human-like. And we'll talk more about that as we go further into the course, and you can find some information on that in your book with Ambrose as well. So ultimately, what this shows is that we started out, if you look back, we started out in 1455 with Gutenberg. We moved to an old style 50 and 100 years later, and that stayed the standard until Caslon in 1725 and Baskerville in 1772, and those then began the traditional era. And then we moved down to the modern era, 1783, 1785. So the 18th century was a very productive era for typography. And finally, by 1896 to 1906, we had moved to the sans serif era. And of course then, roughly 60 years later, this made your favorite font, everybody's favorite font, the most ubiquitous font on the planet. It made Helvetica possible. So that concludes the lesson. If you take a look at Bronco Board, there are some other assignments that you need to work on, including a response to some of the historical elements along with this, and another series of videos that you will need to begin watching roughly February 11th, and we will go from there.